Good evening, friends. Welcome to this session of the book Hail Holy Queen by Scott Hahn. We are now in chapter 2. Something about chapter 1. Let me use the words of Pope John Paul II. He said, God, in his deepest mystery, is a family, which leads us to the motherhood of Mary. The title of chapter 2 is Mary's Motherhood. Is Eden Revisited? Let me begin. The early Christians had a lively devotion to the Blessed Virgin. We find evidence of this in their surviving literature and artwork, and of course in the New Testament, which was their foundational document. While the Mariology of the first 3 centuries was at a primitive stage of development compared to that of a later age, or even our own, it was perhaps more consciously scriptural than many later expressions and more consistently presented in the theological context of creation, fall, incarnation, and redemption. So it sometimes can speak to us with greater clarity, immediacy, and force. For Mary's role makes no sense apart from its context in salvation history. Yet it is not incidental to God's plan. God chose to make his redemptive act inconceivable without her. Mary was in his plan from the very beginning, chosen and foretold from the moment God created man and woman. In fact, the early Christians understood Mary and Jesus to be a reprise of God's creation. St. Paul spoke of Adam as a type of Jesus from Romans 5, verse 14, and of Jesus as the new Adam or the last Adam from 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verses 21 to 22 and 45 to 49. The early Christians considered the beginning of Genesis, with its story of creation and fall and its promise of redemption, to be so Christological in its implications that they called it the Proto-Evangelium, or first gospel. While this theme is explicit in Paul and the Church Fathers, it is implied throughout the New Testament. For example, like Adam, Jesus was tested in a garden, the Garden of Gethsemane, from Matthew 26, verses 36 to 46, and John chapter 18, verse 1. Like Adam, Jesus was led to a tree where he was stripped naked. Matthew 27, verse 31. Like Adam, he fell into the deep sleep of death, so that from his side would come forth the new Eve, his bride, the church. From John chapter 19, verses 26 to 35, and 1 John chapter 5, verses 6 to 8. The motive of the new Adam is nowhere so artfully developed as in the Gospel according to St. John. John does not work out the ideas as a commentator would. Instead, he tells the story of Jesus Christ. Yet, he begins the story by echoing the most primeval story of all, the story of creation in Genesis. This is exciting because you will see the parallelism between Genesis and John. The most obvious echo comes in the beginning. Both books, Genesis and John's Gospel, in fact, begin with those words. The book of Genesis sets out with the words, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth." That's Genesis 1, verse 1. John follows closely, telling us, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God." That's John 1, verse 1. In both cases, we are talking about a fresh start, a new creation. The next echo comes soon afterward. In Genesis chapter 1, verses 3 to 5, we see that God created the light to shine in the darkness. In John 1, verses 4 to 5, we see that the words, "Life was the light of men, and it shines in the darkness." Genesis shows us, in the beginning, the Spirit of God moving over the face of the waters. That's Genesis 1, verse 2. John, in turn, shows us the Spirit hovering above the waters of baptism. John 1, verses 32 to 33. At that point, we begin to see the source of the new creation recounted by John. Material creation came about when God breathed His Spirit above the waters. The renewal of creation would come with the divine life given in the waters of baptism. John the Evangelist continues to leave hints of Genesis throughout his opening narrative. After the first vignette, John's story continues the next day. That's chapter 1, verse 29, with the encounter of Jesus and John the Baptist. The next day, from 1 chapter or verse 35 again, comes the story of the calling of the first disciples. The next day, 1 verse 43, yet again, we find Jesus called to 2 more disciples. So, taking John's first discussion of the Messiah as the first day, we now find ourselves on the 4th day. Then John does something remarkable. He introduces his next episode, the story of the wedding feast at Cana, with the words, "On the 3rd day." Now, he cannot mean the 3rd day from the beginning, since he has already proceeded past that point in his narrative. He must mean the 3rd day from the 4th day, which brings us to the 7th day, and then John stops counting days. Do you notice anything familiar? John's story of the new creation takes place in 7 days, just as the creation story in Genesis is completed on the 6th day and sanctified, perfected on the 7th, when God rests from his labor. The 7th day of the creation week, as of every week thereafter, would be known as the Sabbath, the day of rest, the sign of the covenant. See Exodus chapter 31, verse 17. We can be sure then that whatever happens on the 7th day in John's narrative will be significant. Last section. Jesus arrives at the wedding feast with his mother and his disciples. A wedding celebration in the Jewish culture of the time normally lasted about a week. Yet we find at this wedding that the wine ran out very early, at which point Jesus' mother points out the obvious. They have no wine. That's from John chapter 2, verse 3. It is a simple statement of fact. But Jesus seems to respond in a way that is far out of proportion to his mother's simple observation. "Oh, woman," he says, "what have you to do with me? My hour has not yet come." In order for us to understand Jesus' seeming overreaction, we need to understand the phrase, "What have you to do with me?" Some commentators claim that this represents Jesus' brusque reproach of his mother. However, that does not hold up to careful study. First, we should note that in the end, Jesus does fulfill the request he infers from Mary's observation. If he intended to reproach her, he surely would not have followed his reproach by complying with her request. The decisive evidence against the reproach reading, however, comes from the alleged reproach itself. "What have you to do with me?" was a common Hebrew and Greek idiom in Jesus' day. It is found in several other places in the Old and New Testaments, as well as in sources outside the Bible. In all other occurrences, it certainly does not signify reproach or disrespect. Quite the opposite. It conveys respect and even deference. Consider Luke chapter 8, verse 28, when the line is used verbatim by a man possessed by a devil. It is the demon who puts those words in the possessed man's mouth, and he means them to acknowledge Jesus' authority over both the man and the demon. He says, "I beseech you, do not torment me." He continues, thereby affirming that he must carry out whatever Jesus commands. At Cana, Jesus defers to his mother, though she never commands him. She in turn merely tells the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Thank you. Good night. See you tomorrow.